Welcome to Inside the GMAT. I'm your host, Zach. What does it really take to master the GMAT? How should you tackle each question type? What's the section to section approach? Where do you even begin? There are a lot of ways to answer those questions, and today we're joined by someone with a clear and proven approach. Scott Woodbury-Stewart, founder and CEO of Target Test Prep, or TTP. You've probably heard of it. We're diving into all of it, from how to start your prep, to common mistakes to avoid, to some of the biggest misconceptions that Scott sees about studying for the GMAT. So no matter where you are in your prep journey, this episode is definitely for you. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, Zach. Thanks so much for having me. Really, really a pleasure to be here with you on this podcast this morning.
I'm very happy to hear that. So normally I'd give more of a biography in my episode introductions, but after meeting and chatting with you, I think your story is actually best told in your own words, if you don't mind. So how did you get your start in education and ultimately test prep?
This goes back to me being a kid and a student in middle school and high school. I always felt that things were not as clear as they could be, particularly in math classes and science classes. I mean, I had some really wonderful teachers and really wonderful people in my life, thank God. I always felt like things were not quite as clear. Things were a little murky, and I always thought to myself, Jesus, there's gotta be an easier way to make this. Like, I feel like we're making this like really hard. Where at the end of the day, this is not hard, and it's actually really beautiful and logical. But like something about the way this is being taught and explained, it just never resonated with me. And of course, there was kids smarter than me, and of course they got it because they were super smart kids, and I was like, man, geez, it's got to be a better way than this. Always kind of stuck with me in middle school and high school and stuff. And, when I got to college, I really realized that there were principles of learning that sort of transcend people. Yeah, everyone has our own nuances in terms of how we like to learn, what we like to do, when we like to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But there are cognitive, really well researched cognitive neuroscientific approaches to how the human mind actually sticks information in their head. And at the end of the day, that's all we're doing when we're learning is we're sticking stuff in our head. And, there's a science behind that. And, I really realized that in college. And, I was a science major and a psychology double major and, I studied learning a lot in the brain. And, my first job out of college was teaching. I taught physics, I taught chemistry, I taught math, I taught biology to high school kids. And so I had this wonderful proving ground. And, it's one of those things where I wanted to do better for them than the experience I got. I wanted the kids to know how much I cared about them, how enthusiastic I was. And my goal was always like, look, let's make this simple. Like at the end of the day, this is all that's going on. Like I probably said that, if I had a nickel for every time I said that, I'd be like Warren Buffett today, right? If we could just make this simple, people would get it. And that was my goal, was to make things as simple as possible. And I'm really proud that I feel like I really succeeded. Kids weren't really so enthusiastic about physics, but man, we built rockets, we blew up hydrogen balloons, we did all this cool stuff, and they really learned it because we made it fun and simple. I went on and started tutoring kids for the SAT, and like they were like, "Oh, the SAT is killing me." I'm like, "We're gonna make it so simple. Like, here's the stuff. Here's the roadmap. I'm behind you 100%. This is what we're gonna do." And my kids in the SAT did really well, and I was like, this really worked. And like, I was always of the mindset that like you either are an SAT kid or you're not. Like, you're either a math kid or you were not. Like, I had all these crazy, like almost stupid misconceptions about who people were and learning and what people could do. And I quickly became to realize it's all hogwash. There's no math people, there's no English people, there's no GMAT people, not GMAT people. No, it's only people who have been exposed to the correct way of doing anything and then actually worked really hard and then mastered it and be like, wow, I could do anything I want. So I saw that with the SAT and I saw it with the GRE. I mean, I was doing literally like sometimes 80, 90, 100 hours a week of GRE private tutoring with people. And same thing, harder test, but same thing, man, like make it simple, show them how much I care. People crush the GRE. And I was like, wow, this really works. We're really on to something. And I found the GMAT, and I really fell in love with the GMAT for probably all the reasons that, people at first don't like it. It's challenging, it's logical, it's hard, it's beautiful, it's elegant, there's traps, there's tricks, but at the same time, it's totally beatable, totally gettable, if you know how to study properly and do things right. And I really fell in love with the GMAT. I focused all of my time on teaching for the GMAT and saying 80, 90 hours a week of GMAT prep. And, I took people who, they hadn't found success anywhere. And like, these were my biggest challenges and like opportunities. And they came to me and man, we were successful. Like they were crushing it. Was it easy? Wasn't easy. Was not easy. I'm in no stretch of the word am I saying this is a 6-week crash course. This wasn't like, hey, let's boot camp you to an 800 back in the day. Like this was hard work. This was like marathon prep. This was like Ironman prep, but you know what? Like it was a life-changing event for these people. They went from having a 550 to a 770 and their whole life changed. They went to HBS instead of like staying in the job they didn't like. And like people's lives changed. And I was like, wow, this is insane. Like, I love it. I'm pretty good at this. Like, people are learning, their lives are changing. And then, we kind of said, there's no way this is scalable. And like, this is like 20 years ago. So, like, we were thinking of making a book. We really didn't have like the online presence we had today. And we woke up one morning and said, no, we're not doing a book. We're going to put together an online course. And basically, for the last 20 years, I mean, it sounds like crazy to say, how long it's taken, how much time and care and energy we put into this process. But, over the last 20 years, we've developed a super robust, super straightforward prep course that people have used, like tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of people have used to earn great GMAT scores. And the course has basically been a culmination of everything I know, everything the team knows about learning about the GMAT, about test prep. And, we continue, I'm very proud to say, to have these success stories popping up every day, every week. But it's been quite the journey. It's been
Yeah.
quite the journey. Yeah.
There's so many things that I feel very compelled to respond to. I think chief among them is this idea that you're either a math kid or you're not. You're either a verbal kid or you're not. Growing up, I was labeled as the art kid, which was a label that I wore quite proudly, but I did not like the insinuation that I wasn't good at math. And I wore that label too. And it really wasn't actually until I went to business school where I realized, oh, I do know how to do math. And I credit that to really great teachers. And I also credit that to like this being a school that I opted into, and that, I made a conscious decision that I wanted to learn and I wanted to get, additional education. So really appreciate that you mentioned that. And I'm glad that you bring that into your practice as an educator, not just, in high school or one-on-one tutoring, but in TTP today. I think that is just such a crucial hindrance to a lot of learners. And another thing that I can't help but think of is, um, you know, it's well documented that you're kind of an adrenaline junkie. I'm really curious how some of those personal adventures that you've had, like flying planes or diving with sharks, does that shape your approach to teaching at all? Is it just all about
Yeah.
fun?
No, for sure it has. And to just to talk about the idea of the math person, you're completely right. Like it's one of the most damaging myths in all of education is that any human is anything. I mean, at the end of the day, really the possibilities are almost limitless for all people as long as they're willing to put the time and the effort in. And that comes down to the math or English or anything else, there's only people who have sort of been there, done that, and mastered it, and people who haven't. And, that's one of the biggest messages that I like to put forth is that don't ever think of yourself as a math person or not a math person. Like you can nail it. You can master this material. And yeah, speaking of like the adventure stuff, like it's funny because everything is just a system, like flying planes. It seemed daunting. Like, what am I? I'm going to land this plane at night in the fog and the rain. It's just a system. It's just like math. So at the end of the day, almost taking the adrenaline out of it because you're relying on like what somebody taught you that works. And we know it works. And it's funny. It's like Difference of squares in math shows up all the time on the test. Like someone could teach you how to recognize the difference of squares. Here's how we save time. Here's how we crack a 4 minute question in 30 seconds. And at the end of the day, you're like, oh, that's all it was. Geez, I was expecting more. I'm like, well, now because you mastered it, and it was easy for you on test day, but you had a system. So yeah, like flying planes, it's a system. So even in the worst conditions, you're just relying on proven principles and science and what you know. Honestly, just like taking the GMAT. I love jujitsu. I do a lot of jujitsu. Couldn't be any more principled. The strength and size help? I guess always, but at the end of the day, it's not necessary because you learn the principles and the practices and you know what to do. And at first, it just seems like, wow, how am I going to figure this out? And then you do, and it's magic. It's just like the test, like you figure it out. Someone shows you, but and this is what I want people to really think about. Like, just to use jujitsu. If you had a lot of bad jujitsu teachers who didn't know it themselves, or they didn't care, or they gave you like the crash course, the clip notes to jujitsu, so to speak. God, I don't know. Like maybe you would never get it, and you'd be like, I'm not a jujitsu person. But you got to be smart enough to find your people, right? Like that's a grand theme, like for me of life. Like, who are my people? If the people I have are not working, if my team is not working, I need a new team because it's on me. So if you're studying jujitsu and you're like, this just ain't working, you need new people. And it's the same thing with the GMAT. If you're doing X, Y, or Z, and you're like, this just is not working, now it's your response to be like, what else is out there? What's gonna work for me? And when you find it, it's like magic. You're like, why didn't I do this sooner? And then it's clear that, like the Cliff Notes version probably never did anybody very good. Like the Cliff Notes to anything, sure, I guess there's a purpose for it. But when it comes to big, important things in life, there's probably no shortcuts, right? And that gets into like these misconceptions. Like the faster you try and go, the longer it's going to take you and the worse off you're going to be, right? So you got to be smart enough to realize like, hey, if this is I mean, the GMAT is so well respected by business schools, right? So proven in the industry, so relied upon at this point. Billions of data points, whatever it is. That, like, if the M7 schools are going to use this as a significant part of their application process, it's probably not easy because if everyone went to Harvard Business School, I don't know that Harvard Business School would be that desirable, right? So, like, in your mind, you have to say to yourself, this will probably be a bigger endeavor than what I thought, and I probably need to be smarter about my prep.
Starts thinking about taking the GMAT, how should they frame the challenge ahead? Should they frame it as something that's challenging? Should they frame it as something fun? Like what is like the best mindset in your experience?
Yeah, well, definitely the people who can look at it as a learning experience sort of have the most fun, the least stress, get through it the fastest, learn the most, earn the highest scores. Because at the end of the day, you do learn a ton. And, especially with AI and with the way the world is going, like, you cannot have enough knowledge, right? You cannot have enough critical thinking. And, like, think about it. Like, with AI, like, this is only my humble opinion, but I feel like the only people who will have like an edge over the AI are the people who can think critically
Yeah,
because it can
I
do
agree.
everything else, right? It can do everything else, right? Pretty much already. So in the future, like this critical thinking that the GMAT demands of people is going to be like the most valuable skill in human history, in my opinion, right? Can you figure out how to weaken an argument? Can you see the bad assumptions someone's making? Can you strengthen an argument? Can you strengthen your own argument? Can you pick up the flaw in the argument? When you go through it and you study this stuff for the GMAT and you realize I'm a smarter human being. Like I know things now that are going to help me in all facets of my life. And it was like triple dipping because I was just studying for the GMAT. Like now I'm smarter, more critical, more logically thinking. I'm like just a more well-rounded brain. The people who can see that are really the people who shine. Now, do you have to see it like that? No, but it's going to be a huge feather in your cap if you do. At the end of the day, the minimum bar is you just have to realize you're in competition with some smart, hardworking people. And the number one thing is people just need to give it time. If you said, hey, what's the number one reason, motivated people don't get the score they want? In 20 years of doing this, like my answer is clear. Like take away like working with the wrong materials, but assuming you had the right materials, it would be you just didn't give it enough time. Like in your mind, you were like, this is going to be 3 months. But objectively, let's say it's going to be 7. And man, if you just kept going, you would have got there. But you convinced yourself this shouldn't take more than 3 months. And then you set that like benchmark and you couldn't get it out of your head. Now it's 3.5 months and you're like, this is not for me. But nothing like that works that way in the world. Like no matter what you do, like it's going to take time. So people just have to be prepared at the very least to put the time in. And when they do, magical things happen.
So obviously your philosophy to teaching and like the core of TTP is seeking simple solutions to complex problems. And I think that, that mission or ethos or whatever you want to call it applies really well to Quant. So Scott, why do you think Quant is such a sticking point for so many students? Is it because it's taught in a complicated way?
I think the problem starts early in education. Math is extremely linear. What you learn in fourth grade carries over to fifth grade or not. What you learn in fifth grade carries over to sixth grade or not. And, as I said, having been a teacher for a long time, like I saw those sort of inefficiencies in the educational system in general. So I think, by the time kids get to high school, I mean, they've missed so many of the crucial beauties of math, right? And I think, some people choose to not take math courses in college or just take the minimum. So like not only did they not have like the best sort of education leading up to college, but then they're away for it for so long. The thing too, though, you have to realize is that, at least from my point of view, our educational system is not great at teaching critical reasoning. Like, yes, there's a lot of math on the test, but it's not just the rote memorization of the math. It's can we think critically about this math? Because the math is irrelevant. Really, at the end of the day, we're using that as a proxy to say, can someone think critically about these math structures? Right. So it starts long ago and just sort of grows more sort of entrenched by the time people get to the test. So we're fighting a lot of factors. And that's why it's such a great feeling when someone realizes they can do it.
Is there one subject area that you would say is the first thing that you should take a look at if you're approaching Quant linearly?
Yeah, I mean, it really does start with sort of the basic skills that people lack, like what's a unit digit? Some people don't know that, right? What are patterns in unit digits? Like most people don't know that. Just starting with like, what are all of these like core things that may seem varied, but we don't know? Which fraction is bigger, right? How do you arrange decimals in order? Like all of these things that, geez, if we don't know these, it's hard to move on to the stuff like work or rate or stuff like that. So really building that foundation of like arithmetic and basic algebra, because that really builds the foundation for everything you do.
Something that you've talked about is that it's not really about solving the math, it's about being able to approach a problem and think about that problem critically. So, what is like your one key strategy for mastering those problem solving questions if it's not really about doing the math?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the math is sort of fundamental to it, right? I guess you would say the math is necessary but not sufficient. Okay, because it's interesting. And this is what happens. So like people will say, oh, you just have to be a better thinker, more logical. You have to be a better critical reasoner. And people are like, okay, well, how do I become more of a critical reasoner? How do I become more logical? Well, the thing is, if you don't have those skills, those math skills, it's impossible. Like, for example, imagine you knew nothing about probability and someone was like, you need to get more logical at probability. You'd be like, okay, well, how do I do that? Like, I don't know, you have to be more logical. You have to think more logical about probability.
The odds are
And they
pretty
did.
bad.
Yeah, yeah,
But
no
that'll
no
help.
pun intended. Yeah, odds are pretty bad. There's low probability you would succeed, right? But once you start learning about probability, independent probabilities, dependent probabilities, probabilities and combinations, probabilities and permutations, now you actually have like the mindware, the actual like software to actually think critically, right? And so much of the critical thinking of math is innate to the math itself. Like once you have that knowledge, then someone could be like, hey, when you see this, this is our thought process, right? When you see that, this is our thought process. So that's a major point for anybody, listening to the podcast is like, and I see it all the time. If you're trying to get more logical, get better at the material, get better at the math, and then you'll be in a position to actually get more
So
logical.
in that regard, do you think the logic comes more naturally?
I think a lot of the logic is inherent in the math itself, and then the stuff that's not is easily taught. For example, like speaking of combinations, there's a ton people can do to be a more critical thinker about for sort of combinations and permutations questions, for example. And then there's just some things that you might not catch, and someone has to show you. And they say, okay, as I said, when you see this question, here's how you think about it. And maybe you didn't come up with that logical structure on your own. Someone kind of gave it to you, popped it in your head, but now you have it, right? You're like, oh, of course, when I see that, put these folks here, put these folks here, done. So when you see it again, you're like, okay, folks here, done. So it's a kind of iterative process of picking stuff up on your own and actually having someone show you, okay, once you know this math, here's how we think about these specific sort of circumstances.
You mentioned before that practice doesn't always make perfect. But for me, if I can't think about how to meaningfully track your progress in quant without just doing a bunch of questions. Why am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong, actually. It's a good point. It's just that people have to be practicing correctly, right? So the thing is like, like one sort of inefficient prep strategy is they'll just do like 1,000 questions, right? But geez, like that's not really systematic. You know, it's like, imagine doing a landing today and a takeoff tomorrow and a refueling. And I don't know, you never actually learn the ins and outs of the landing or right? Because for example, like maybe you only saw 6 or 8 questions. Does that mean you're gonna show up on test day and be capable of doing any rate question? I've never seen that be true. So, and also, are you learning the right way of doing them? People can practice incorrectly. Like, imagine going to the golf course and swinging, the club 10,000 times wrong. You're probably way worse at the end of that 10,000 swings than you were even before, So I think you can practice not the right way and be worse.
I really like that golf analogy because not only are you not getting better at golf by swinging the wrong way, you actually might be hurting yourself in other ways by swinging it correctly. You could hurt your back, you could be hurting your arms. So I think that's actually a really astute analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. And same thing with the GMAT. If you just get a book of 1,000 questions and you do them, okay, but did you really learn how to do these? Are you doing them in the right way? But now imagine the difference where, like, okay, this week I'm going to read, 50 really well-written pages on rate time distance. I'm going to solve 50 really representative time-worn GMAT rate time distance concepts and watch the solutions and watch an instructor explain them. And then I'm going to do, 150 questions in the chapter test to really, put this together. And people are like, oh God, I'm tired already. But at the end of that, you're going to be prepared to answer rate time distance. And if you continue to practice more of them, amazing. But you've learned it, you've learned how to do it, you've learned the tricks, the strategies, you learned what not to do, when to do it, when not to do it, and you've practiced it, you can take that off the list. And if you do that with, say, say there's say 20 major GMAT, like quant topics, for example, in my mind, right? If you did that with all of them, you crush it. You crush it. You might not get any questions wrong. You might be like, this is all I got. Seriously, But if you do 1,000 random questions, yeah, you can get better. I mean, I don't mean to say you can't get better. It just doesn't seem as systematically done as it could be,
And I think this is where having the time to actually do the right kind of prep really comes into play because you need to give yourself time to really quote unquote master these different topics. So yeah,
Yeah.
time is crucial. What do people struggle with when it comes to the verbal section in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just as the math has a lot of sort of well-known issues for people like starting back in fourth grade, so does the verbal. Like if you look at like reading comprehension, I don't know that people were ever in general sort of trained how to read correctly. So again, they think to themselves, I'm not a good reader, or I am a good reader. It's not true. There's only people who have learned how to read and people who haven't. And people are like, wait a minute, I can read. Like, I know you all can read, but there's a difference between being able to read something and being able to really read something the way that the GMAT demands that you read something critically. Like people will be reading a paragraph and they'll get to the end of the paragraph and they realize they don't know a thing about what they just read. I've done it. I did it this morning.
Yeah.
So now on the test, like people have to learn the tools, and there are tools, like for example, take a sentence by sentence. If you don't understand the sentence by the end of the sentence, you won't understand it by the end of the paragraph. And that seems so logical, but no one does it. They'll read the whole essay and like, I have no idea what they said. So, like, for example, you stop at the end of every sentence. What did that sentence say? What does it mean? Why did the author burn the glucose, what I'm saying, to like write that sentence? And then it builds. Okay, what's the second sentence? What's the second sentence mean? And how does it relate to the first? So it's this iterative process of, am I understanding this as I go? And there's 40 strategy you can use like that. You put it together and you're like, wow, I'm reading for the first time ever. Like I'm riding a bike for the first time. So people get to the test and they haven't quite mastered the art of reading. And the thing is, like that almost seems like, nah, that can't be true. Right? It almost seems so crazy of me to say that people can't believe it. Like, what do you mean I can't read? I'm like, I'm not saying you can't read. I know that you're a very accomplished person. I get it. But you're not reading the way you should be reading. And once they're like, you know what, he's right. Then they can really be prepared to actually learn how to read. And then reading comprehension gets a billion times better. Reading gets a billion times. Data insights gets better, right? And then the thing too with verbal is I'm a human too. So I fall into this category to be clear. People are very irrational. I think it's a trait of humans, and it is a trait of humans, actually. If you look at the work of people like Daniel Kahneman and that studied the brain, our brains really weren't hardwired to make really carefully thought out logical decisions. Like we have to learn to override these like type one fast but not very sort of high fidelity brain responses, which are very comfortable to use, by the way. We have to take those offline and bring online like the deeper part of our brain that's very uncomfortable to use and say to ourselves, called type 2 reasoning, what's really going on here? And I feel like people can go their whole lives and not really do that, not really be forced to do that. But that's critical reasoning. And that's the world of success. Like, how can you make a good decision about anything if you're going to use this shallow logic that doesn't work in the year 2025? Might have worked 180, thousand years ago, but not today. So critical reasoning, like you get to this thing, like which of the following would weaken the argument? I don't know. I've never actually thought about what it takes to weaken an argument. And if I haven't really done a deep dive. I'm just firing from the hip. Like that's people. That's humans. That can be me if I'm not careful, right?
I think this is so interesting, by the way, and I'm just trying to wrap my own head around it. Are you saying that there's sort of like innate biases that we have when we approach questions that are like critical reasoning or reading comprehension?
Totally. Yeah. If you look at researchers who study the brain, like this field of heuristics, right? We know what people do. We know the logic. If you take a group of 1 million people, like everyone can be different, but in large bodies, large numbers of people, we know how humans are going to react to situations. It's very well studied. So you come with these biases, right? And then you not only you come with these biases, but like you don't ever stop to think if they're good, bad, ugly, are they going to work, not going to work. So you fall into the traps. Like you don't even see the traps coming because you're so like confirmation bias. Like you're so sure you don't even see the trap coming. So people get their critical reasoning and they've never really been forced to do that. But the beauty is, just like math, it's very formulaic.
So obviously, one common mistake would be folks not thinking critically or maybe not stepping outside themselves to look at what a correct answer might be, or people who read fast and not with purpose. What are some other common mistakes that you see as people approach prepping verbal, and how should they avoid them?
Yeah, you know what? Even more so than math, I think people in verbal sort of subscribe to a lot of the gimmicks that are out there that sound good but don't really work. Like particularly in critical reasoning, you see people who will, you know, engage in pre-thinking or like thinking about, the answer choices like before they've even read them. And like if you read the first question and then you read the paragraphs, the passage looking for the answer there, what are you doing? You're looking for the answer to that one question instead of actually interpreting, understanding, comprehending the passage that will actually allow you to answer all the questions. No, but it seems so like slick. You're like, ooh, of course. Why didn't Scott tell me that?
That's so interesting because when I think about approaching these questions, and when I did approach these questions, I did read the answers first because I either assumed that was the best approach for me. I will say I think that sometimes an approach can be subjective based on people's strengths and weaknesses. But, the answers are the things that sometimes have the traps. So it's possible that you could be looking for proof of the trap, reading the answers first and then the passage. That's really interesting. And I think that maybe one section that has some of the biggest misconceptions would be the data insights section, if you don't mind moving on to the third and final one.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And what a cool section that is. It's super sort of up to the modern world, like this culmination of all the skills we need to succeed in business and life. And yeah, I think what makes that challenging is take everything we've talked about for quant, take everything we've talked about for verbal, and now let's sort of, in ways, shapes, and forms, integrate it together and even ask even an additional layer of thought among people. The biggest tip I can give people about data insights is you really have to, if you master quant and verbal first, and then you move on to data insights, your life will be so much easier because what happens is, like someone will come to me, I'll be like, okay, like, let me see the data insights questions you're getting wrong. And they're like, "Oh, I don't understand graphs. I don't understand the tab system." And at the end of the day, like they don't understand either the quant or the verbal or both, right? And it just appears it's a data insights problem, but really it's starting even more fundamental than that. It's the underlying math or underlying verbal. So, like, once that's up to speed, adding the data insights on, it's just a formality, really, in understanding the question types, understanding the strategies, because they're a lot more sort of strategic and tactical than the quant and verbal. But you got to know the quant and verbal, right? Like sorting the table. Like how and when are we sorting the tables? To me, that's very specific to data insights, just as an example, right? There's a ton of strategies and actual tactics you can learn. Like, okay, let's sort the table this way. Let's not sort it this way. Let's do X, let's do Y. But at the end of the day, like if there's quant later in there, they're still going to get it wrong. So they do the quant and the verbal first, and then they move on to the data insights. And that really helps people.
Yeah, I think that this section can be so overwhelming because of the question types. I mean, there's five of them. They include graphs, they include tables. Like, how can somebody best manage that anxiety when they see it for the first time? Because, like, I get it. It sounds simple to like master the quant, master the verbal, and apply those core foundational topics to these questions. I'm really speaking for myself here, honestly, Scott. It's like it's so hard to put away the pressure of being able to interact with these things.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And it's again, it comes back to proper practice makes perfect, like starting with like data sufficiency, been on the test for a long time. You know, like people struggle with data sufficiency because they haven't actually mastered the underlying quant again, right? So master the quant and then practice the heck out of data sufficiency. And after a while, Like you start to even understand what's going to happen before it happens. Same thing with the stuff for the graphs and the tables, with like the multi-source reasoning or the table analysis and the graphics interpretation. They follow patterns, so there tends to be patterns that arise over space and time. So, like once you see it and you've learned it, you have a really good chance of, I'm not seeing the exact same stuff for sure, but the same principles, the same theories, the same approaches are going to work. So, yeah, there's a bunch of graphs, but they're all pretty basic. Once someone shows you, like, here are the graphs, here's how we read them. Again, like, people really weren't taught that. Like, I see people showing up on like a graphics interpretation question, Zach, and, they didn't know the legend was important. And it sounds funny, but like nothing is funny to me anymore. I'm like, okay, I get it. Like as you said, empathy. Like, yeah, I get it. Geez, like shame on someone for not teaching you this. Like, we got to read the legend. We have to know, what do the blue diamonds mean? What do the black squares mean? And people are like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. And then like 90 of those things come together, and now they know how to swoop in to, a graph, a line graph, a scatter plot, and put it all together. Bane of my existence is fact that you can have like strongly correlated data sets, but not necessarily have causation. But like every day, something like, I never heard of that. And I'm like, this is great because this is going to show up. Like you have to know, just because like two data sets move almost perfectly together, it doesn't mean that there's a causation. Like margarine rates and the divorce rates in the state of Maine. I always think of that. They move almost perfectly together. As the margarine sales go up, so too do the divorce rates. And you're like, okay, it must be a cause and effect. Well, probably not. But like just something like that. Like once you learn it, you're like, yeah, of course they're probably not a cause and an effect, right? So like the same thing, like these graphs have content and skills that people should have learned, but probably through no fault of their own didn't. And now they learn them. And like, okay, like that's all it is. So it's kind of the same as the other sections, just bigger.
Yeah. And I think this section is actually a really good time to bring up the strategy or the practice revolved around time management. With so many things to click on and observe and read and decipher, I feel like, again, I'll speak from my own experience. It was really easy to waste a lot of time on these questions. What do you look for specifically in these questions to conserve your time?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. And the time management is always sort of highly individualized for people. Like in the course, we give people like 4 or 5 different ways to approach time management on the sections, depending on, everyone has a different preference for how to do it. Some people want to watch it like a hawk. Some people don't want to watch it like a hawk. But the beauty of it, and this is sort of maybe the biggest secret, is that when they're prepared, it almost doesn't matter because, and this is a great way for people to think about it. What I tell people is don't prepare until you can get the questions right. Prepare until you can't get them wrong and fast. So like when they do that, because man, the timing, it's just like, it's probably the toughest thing because like if you're taking someone who's less than fully prepared, the time is like this rotten cherry on top of a big sundae. You're like, it could go either way. Because at the end of the day, like there's other things in place that are not working. So obviously you do the best you can. But you know what, Zach? When people have prepared in a way they can't get the questions wrong, it almost doesn't matter the time approach they take, as long as they're just obviously being careful not to, run out of time, as long as they're not wasting 8 minutes per question. There's some obvious things. So, I think like the more important thing for people to think about is the time pressure will evaporate as the skills approach that necessary level. Because and that's a mistake people make in quantum verbal and data insights is they try and rush, especially in verbal. I can see they'll always try and do the questions under time conditions. So they'll never be able to do them under time conditions. And the analogy I give is, let's say you want to play the piano. You want to play Guns N' Roses November Rain. You like rock songs, right? It's a pretty cool, piano song. Try and play it, make it sound like Axl Rose playing it the first day. It ain't happening. And if you try and do that every subsequent day, it's never going to sound like November Rain. But if you, if you go slow at first and you build those skills methodically and you get better at playing that song, in a month or two, you're playing it better than he was. Maybe not, but you're playing it really well. So, like, that's the thing is like, you can't rush those early stages of your prep. If you rush CR from the get go, you'll always be slow. If you rush data insights, you'll always be slow, you know? So by going slow first, you allow yourself to build skill, and it's actually skill that translates into speed. So like that's the coolest thing is that when people build skill, they don't really worry about the timing anymore. A little bit, but not to the degree that people think they have to, because they can just do it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it makes so much sense hearing it that skill translates to speed, but sometimes you need to hear that from somebody else, which kind of brings me to I kind of want to do a rapid fire list of questions about some common mistakes that I've observed. And the first one is, can you be successful in prepping for the GMAT alone?
You can. You can. Yeah, I think you can, but I think for most people you can't. I mean, it's possible, sure, but I think it takes a village. I think the more people you have on your side, the better you're going to do. Whether that's coaches or courses or a really supportive spouse, the more people you have in your corner, I think the better you're going to do.
And what about doing too much? Can you do too much prep that it actually hurts you?
Well, that's a great question. You can, but very rarely have I ever saw that to be the case. It's usually the reverse, the inverse. It's usually not doing enough, right? So by and large, I mean, I would say in 95-ish percent of cases, not doing enough. I guess you could do too much, especially leading up to the test. That's when you could do too much. Like, I often tell students, like running a marathon, the work has already been done, by a month before the test. Now we're just tapering down, letting the body recover, getting ready to perform our best, on the marathon day. So that's when you can do too much. I see people who are taking practice tests the day before the test, the morning of the test. I'm like, oh no, we're not doing this. Like, we need to be well rested. So that's when you can do too much. But overall, most people are not doing enough.
And my last quick question for you is obviously time is a huge factor into successful prep. What role does consistency play within that allotment of time?
Yeah, consistency is super, super, super important. And I think it comes to like the difference between motivation and discipline. People say, how can I motivate myself to study for the GMAT? Well, I don't know. What's your why? Like, why are you taking it? Like, where are you going in life? I mean, that can help you be motivated. But at the end of the day, as a human being, motivation will wax and wane, and you won't be motivated every day. Nobody will. But that's where discipline kicks in, and consistency will come from discipline. Like every day, you know what? This is a 6 month endeavor. I'll be up every day at 6, and I'll study until 8 before work. That's killer. That is killer. You know why? Because you're doing something for yourself before you leave for work. You're already 2 hours into your GMAT prep before you start your day. Your brain is fresh. You have peace and quiet. You have coffee, whatever you do, tea, and you learn. And you do that every day. Like that's the discipline. That's the consistency, that allows you to make forward progress. Because if you're doing a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, not now, like it tends to be perishable, right? But the more you do consistently, the more you solidify this knowledge, these skills, and the better stuff is going to work.
As we wrap up here, I want to put myself in the listener's shoes and ask you for somebody who's maybe doubting their ability to get a competitive GMAT score, what's the one thing you would say to them?
You can. I've seen, I don't know how many tens of thousands of students I've worked with personally, students I've coached via email, students who have used the course. I mean, it's probably in the hundreds of thousands of students by now, to be honest. You can. You 100% can do it. If you put in the time, if you study smart, you can get a great score on the GMAT. And now like I have had the benefit of like working with people for almost 20 years. I see literally, and I truly mean this from the bottom of my heart. I see how differently the lives of these people have become as a result of the GMAT. Now, is it only the GMAT? No. I mean, they worked hard in their jobs, They put together great applications. They worked hard in business school. But many of them, I don't think would have followed the path they had followed if they didn't get a great GMAT score, because it literally opened the door for them to a better life. Yes, top business school, a significant other they wanted, a wedding they wanted, a job they wanted, an income they wanted, like whatever it was. Like I see these people now on LinkedIn, like 20 years ago. Like I remember them. I remember where they were at. I remember the people who were like down on their life. I remember the people like, I don't like my job. I don't like my salary. I don't like flying every day. I'm a management consultant, but I want to be in investment banking. I'm in iBanking, but I want to be in, whatever it was. Like I remember where they were at, and like I see their trajectory. So, for me, it's clear what literally taking 6 months of their life to study for the GMAT and getting a good score, how it has affected their lives. So anybody can do it. And anybody who wants to should do it.
Where can people learn more about you and Target Test Prep?
Yeah, of course. Targettestprep.com, or pretty much anywhere else on the internet where the GMAT is spoken about. But yeah, of course, we love helping people, and at the end of the day, like that's one of our strongest drivers of success. Is we truly do care about people, and we do still to this day a personalized sort of white glove approach to our students, and I just think they benefit so much from that. So yeah, targettestprep.com, and if you're studying for the GMAT, we would be delighted to be a partner with you on your journey.
Scott, thank you so much for your time and wisdom, and I can't wait to have you back.
It was great being here. Thanks so much, Zach. I really appreciate it.